So I just wanted to put a trigger warning at the very beginning of this video because I'm going to be talking about domestic violence. So if you are a victim of domestic violence or past domestic violence, please be aware that this might be triggering. Today, several of you, including friends, brought to my attention this Amouranth situation. And honestly, I had no idea who she is. I found out that she is a very famous Twitch streamer, and I think she's like one of the top OnlyFans account holders. So my first reaction was, oh, OnlyFans, like I don't know if that's something I want to touch. And then it was followed up by the subsequent thought of like, well, what would people think of me if I covered something like that? And whenever that comes up nowadays, I pay attention, because in the past when I was younger, caring about what people thought or worrying about that guided my life. Now, when that comes up, I know it's a sign to do the exact opposite, that I should cover it, because this is something that's very important. And this is actually something I can cover because I have a deep, long history working in the domestic violence space. But before I get into that, let me just give you guys a quick rundown of the situation with Amouranth. So her real name is Caitlin, so I'll use Caitlin. Caitlin has basically a business, and Vice did this interview with her where she states that she makes $1.5 million a month. Let me repeat that, $1.5 million a month off her Twitch and her OnlyFans account. And that is a crazy amount of money. I looked at her content very quickly before doing this video, but it's very provocative. But as I did more research, I found out that potentially it was her husband's idea for her to do the live streaming on Twitch and to create the OnlyFans account. And on Sunday, October 16th, Caitlin was doing a live stream, and I guess at some point she decided she was muted, and then she decided to unmute, and you could hear this man going off on her.
I'm not just...
I said I'm going to tell you what I said.
I guess the biggest revelation out of all this for some of her fans is the fact that she's married, and they're so angry about that. And that's completely missing the point, because this man was so abusive to her and immediately threw two red flags to me, because it was very clear that this was an abusive relationship, because he, one, was going off on her because she didn't hear something he said, and then he went straight into threatening to kill her dogs.
No, stop.
Why did you say you were gonna kill dogs?
Literally picture Kyron goes to a meatpacking house, and that's what made me lose it.
And then through the texts that was happening around the same time, because I guess she was streaming and he couldn't get a hold of her. So he lost his mind and he started saying things like, oh, I'm donating $250,000 to this, or, oh, I just threw away $500,000 on an auction. So when men in this situation control a woman's finances or threatens her well-being or the well-being of her animals or children, which is not the case here, but it often is in abusive relationships, that's a sign that this is an abusive relationship. So I did a lot of soul searching today, and I realized that this is something I really need to cover. Like the situation with the Try Guys, the instances of sexual harassment, sexual misconduct, and discrimination, as well as domestic violence, they are things that people do not talk about enough. And this is something that's very near and dear to my heart, the issue of domestic violence. It's something that's been part of my professional life for over 10 years, but I don't talk about it very much because it's not something I do in my everyday life. So I went to law school to be a DA. It was very important to me from a young age that I wanted to do something that would make a difference. I've had the dream of being a novelist, but the runner-up to that was being a lawyer, being a DA, protecting the vulnerable and the voiceless and the powerless. That's something that's incredibly important to me. And so you'll see in a lot of my videos, if I'm not talking about Hollywood law, I'm going to be talking about this. And during law school, I was part of the Women's Law Association, and I started volunteering at this women's shelter, and this women's shelter has a law clinic attached to it. So basically what would happen is if these victims of domestic violence would come in, and first they would meet with the therapist, they would do like a group therapy session, and then after that, the law clinic was available, and it would usually be a few lawyers. I was kind of a constant. For 10 years, I was there every Monday Monday. I was probably one of the consistent lawyers who would volunteer and who would be there every Monday. And I know men are victims of domestic violence, but this shelter was dedicated to women. It was a safe haven for women who wanted to leave their abusers. They could bring their children with them and they could potentially stay there, I think, for a week or two until they found somewhere else to go, either to stay with a relative or to find alternative housing. Because my work meant that I was helping women get restraining orders. There were a lot of restraining orders, divorces, helping them with the divorce proceedings, helping them get child support for their kids. This was probably some of my most proud work as an attorney, but also some of my darkest and saddest work. What would happen with these women is, I would give them my full attention, my love and support, basically, and all of my legal knowledge in order to help them get away from their abusers. And I basically would give them my belief in them and my confidence in them. They're worthy of being not a victim of domestic violence, not to be abused by another human being. So yes, I would give them my energy. I would give them everything so that they could feel a little better about themselves, because I knew at the end of my session, I would get to go home to my husband or my daughter and I would be safe. But these women would be going back to the homes where their abusers were. And I will say that in the 10 years I've worked there, I helped support hundreds of women. And there were women that I would help for a few times and I never saw them again. And then there were women that I would see week in and week out for years. And those were the women who never left their abusers. And I always hoped that the women I didn't see again had left and were safe, because no one deserves to be abused. No one deserves to live in fear every day. So I want to go back and cover Caitlin's story a little bit, because I want to talk about what does domestic violence look like, because a lot of people might be in abusive situations or abusive relationships and don't realize that they are in a cycle of violence. So there is something that's called a cycle of abuse. And this was something that was coined in the 1970s by psychologist Lorna Walker in her book, The Battered Woman. And so the cycle of abuse has 4 stages. Actually, the cycle has been updated and is now called something else. But let's start with this, because this is the basis for a lot of the understanding around domestic violence and around abuse. The cycle of abuse would involve 4 stages. 1 is the building of tension, 2 is an incident of abuse, 3 is reconciliation, and 4 is calm. So basically, tensions will build, the abusive partner will lash out somehow, and it could be anything. It could be family issues, it could be trouble at work, it could be physical illness or fatigue. So usually the victim, when they sense the tension is building, they will try to placate their partner and to prevent the abuse from happening. So the victim usually feels anxious, on guard, hyper alert of their partner's potential needs. You might tiptoe around them, trying to not to set them off and making an extra effort to provide physical and emotional support. So the abuser eventually releases the tension on others, and then that abuse might include insults or name calling, threats of harm, or actual physical destruction. You hear a lot about like doors being pulled off hinges and walls being smashed. And Caitlin actually showed in her live stream pictures of the door being kicked in and holes in the wall that her husband made. This could also be attempts to control the victim's behavior, sexual or physical violence, or emotional manipulation. They often will say something like, oh, well, you're making me mad, or it's your fault. I don't know if you guys have ever heard the burnt toast analogy, that example that gets used a lot. So a wife will burn the toast and then the husband will go off and beat her because she burned his toast, and he'll say, well, you made me mad, you made me angry. By the way, no one can make you feel happy, no one can make you feel angry. We get to decide how we feel. So if anybody ever tells you that, that's BS, and you do not deserve that. So the third stage of this cycle is reconciliation. So tension fades, then in an attempt to move past the abuse, the abuser will often use kindness, gifts, loving gestures to usher in the honeymoon stage. This devoted behavior can trigger the release of dopamine and oxytocin, helping you feel even more closely bonded and leading you to believe that you have your real relationship back. And then the fourth stage of the cycle is calm. To maintain that peace and harmony, both parties generally have to come up with some sort of explanation or justification for the abuse. The abusive partner might apologize while blaming others, point to outside factors to justify their behavior, minimize the abuse or deny it happened, accuse you of provoking them. They might show plenty of remorse, assure you it won't happen again, and seem more attuned to your needs than ever. You might begin to accept their excuses, even doubt the memory of the abuse. Like like it was nothing, like they said. And then you will feel certain that this won't happen again. And so I think there was like 24 hours when the public did not know what was happening with Caitlyn. She kind of went offline. She said today, Monday, that she was going to get back online, and her live stream got cut off and she didn't come back online. And I believe very late Monday night, because this is now very late Monday night, she came back online and said that her husband is getting help. I was so relieved to see her alive, to be honest, because the unhinged way her husband was talking to her on the phone, I was really scared that he was going to physically harm her. I believe today through Twitter and through her assistants, it sounded like cops were showing up at her house. I think Caitlyn even Twittered at some point that the cops had shown up. And so she had to go talk to them. And in her stream tonight, she clearly described this cycle that happens in their relationship. She's like, oh yeah, it's been like the tension has been there for a few years now. And then it really kind of like exploded. I guess there was an incident a couple nights ago at TwitchCon, and I think her husband either locked her out of her hotel room or there was an incident and cops were called. Her cameraman, which she now says is her ex-cameraman, tried to help him, and she got very upset because she said that him calling the cops really set her husband off. So there's this cycle definitely of abuse. I mean, the fact that he controlled all their finances is a big red flag. Let me say this. I was very angry at some of the Twitter comments I was reading throughout the day today as I was trying to, get any signs of life from her. The men just saying that she was lying, saying that she has money so she can't possibly be a victim of abuse, that she was doing this as a publicity stunt to make more money. And I call BS on all of that because, by the way, she has nothing to gain from this, from making this public. I think telling people that she has a husband actually hurts her OnlyFans account. If people knew that she was lying about this, she would probably get canceled and she would lose all of her fans and all of her followers. I truly believe in seeing her cry and seeing the fear and the utter hopelessness on her face. Her unmuting and letting us hear her husband was clearly her escape against him. And having worked with victims of domestic violence for over 10 years, this is clearly a victim of domestic violence. Clearly, she has been controlled by her husband. He's been controlling all of her finances. I mean, she says at some point, this is the empire that you have built on my body. And that just broke my heart. I mean, I believe that she's probably been held hostage.
And I don't have to wear cleavage every day. I can wear clothes. Master has given Dobby a sock. Dobby is free.
So all the men who are upset that she had a husband and was lying about her husband are totally missing the point. The point is she has been held hostage. She is a victim of domestic violence. She says as of tonight that he's getting help, but I don't know what that means. I worry that he's going to go get therapy for a few weeks and then come back, and then the cycle will happen again and again. When I was at the shelter, we worked with something that was called the power and control wheel. So this wheel offers a more concise diagram of what some of the most common behaviors experienced by people in abusive relationships, because the previous cycle, it wasn't broad enough. So when women would read it or try to figure out like, well, am I in an abusive relationship? And if their situation didn't fall into those 4 stages perfectly, they would think, oh, okay, so this is not domestic violence then. Maybe I shouldn't try to leave. And I'll link all this. So this is a Healthline article that I'm reading that gives a summary on domestic violence. I will link it below, and I will also show the circle here. This is the power and control wheel. So basically this talks about how the abuser will use 8, these are kind of the 8 sections. They'll use coercion and threats, they'll use intimidation, they'll use emotional abuse, they'll use isolation. That's a big one. A lot of the victims at the shelter would talk about the fact that they don't get to see their friends anymore. They never leave the house other than to go grocery shop or pick up the kids. Minimizing, denying, and blaming, using children or big power leverage for the abusers, using male privilege, and this means treating the woman as a servant, making all the big decisions, acting like the master of the castle, being the one to define men and women's roles, using economic abuse, using coercion and threats. So I want to talk about the economic abuse really quickly, because this is what held back a lot of women at the shelter from leaving. They didn't feel like they could leave because their husbands either worked or they held all the bank accounts. So this is what I want to tell victims of domestic violence out there. If you want to leave, you should try to get help. I will link down below a national helpline for victims of domestic violence. You can call them or chat with them, and you can start planning. This is what I tell all the women at the shelter. If you can, figure out where the finances are. We don't have paper bills as much, but if you can get online access, make sure you take screenshots of everything, make sure you know how much are in the accounts. A lot of men in these kind of control situations, because this is ultimately about control. It's about power and control. And a lot of the men will hide money or have separate accounts so that you don't know exactly where everything is. Make a plan. Talk to your family members or friends to see if you can potentially stay with them, because the number one thing that you have to do is you have to get out. You have to escape, and you have to have the courage to actually leave. And I know it's really hard. I know it's really scary, but if you can make plans, if you can start figuring out where your finances are, you can find a safe place to go. There are shelters all around the country that they will take you in and give you an anonymous and safe situation until you can find another place to go. And like the situation with Caitlin, I think now she has control of her finances again. I think she needs to get some legal help and figure out how to get control back of her business and her money, because that will take away a lot of the power that the abusers have over their victims. Here's the thing that people don't realize. A lot of the women who would come into the shelter, they're not what people think. They are women who are lawyers and doctors and highly functioning professionals. Their number one question is always, how did I get here? I'm so embarrassed. I'm so full of shame. I can't tell anybody because they could never believe that this is happening to me. And I think what happens to a lot of these women is they grow up in these cycles of abuse. They potentially have dads or even moms who are abusive growing up. And so they go from one situation of abuse to another situation of abuse because it's comfortable and it's familiar. And a lot of the victims think they deserve it. So I want to tell you this. If you are a victim of domestic violence, you do not deserve this. You are worthy of love and being safe and being respected. If you need help, please contact one of the numbers below. You can write me at my email below, and I can do what I can to give you advice, or at least a listening ear. There's nothing more important to me as an attorney is to help people who are powerless, who are voiceless, who feel invisible. So please don't stay. Do it for yourself. Do it for your kids. This is Tyler, the Hollywood attorney. I'm sorry for such a heavy topic today, but this needed to be said.